Picture a scene. It's 1995. Britpop is still the greatest form of popular music ever created. You have a clock-doubled 486 with a CD-ROM drive. There's just one question. What are you playing on it? Transport Tycoon did that. No, wait. The Need for Speed. That was the title we're going for here. The Need for Speed is a game I've wanted to make a video about for a while, and I was reminded of this encountering a 3DO in the wild. Because for me, this really is not just the story of a PC game, because the first time I saw the Need for Speed was indeed on a 3DO in a game shop, probably somewhere in Woking. And if you cast your mind back to when the Need for Speed came out on 3DO, and grunge was still the greatest form of... No, wait, you did that joke, and you were also about 2 years out of date with that reference. But at the time I saw it, I was still sort of very much in that world of 16-bit computers. I had a PC, friends had Amigas and Atari STs. Seeing this was just one of those, what is that? I need one of those. And of course I never did get a 3DO. That's probably quite good, because about a year or so later the Need for Speed came to PC, and by that point the PC I was using was not a 286. I had access to a couple of fast 486s. And the Need for Speed really felt like a game that was powering into a new era. Which is odd, because for me, looking back as kind of a bit of a historian, the Need for Speed doesn't really represent the dawning of a new era, and that may seem a very weird thing to say, because the Need for Speed, come on man, this is the start of one of the longest running motor racing game franchises in history, and surely the first game is, by definition, the start of a new era. But I want to bring up maybe a controversial idea here, which is the Need for Speed is not the first Need for Speed game. It is in fact, despite what the title may say, the last Test Drive game. Before you denounce me as completely crazy, I think it's worth going and looking at who wrote these games. So let's take Test Drive, and by Test Drive I mean the classic Test Drives 1 and 2, which were written by Distinctive Software and published by Accolade before the two of those companies had a very big falling out, and Accolade went off and built Test Drive 3 and kind of forgot to put any handling for CPU speed in them. The Need for Speed, on the other hand, was written by EA Canada, or in fact a sub-team of EA Canada called Pioneer Productions, a fairly short-lived sub-team who are credited on just 4 games, 2 of those being the Need for Speed and its special edition. But EA Canada was not formed through creation, it was formed through acquisition. Indeed, Electronic Arts paying what was reported to be about $11 million for a small Canada-based company called Distinctive Software. You kind of see how this starts to come together. And indeed, many of the developers who worked on the Need for Speed were also developers on the Test Drive series. And this is where I think you can see this lineage coming. And looking at the gameplay of Test Drive, this out there notion actually starts to make a lot more sense, because if we look at Test Drive 1, what do we see? We see a game where we drive a variety of sports cars and supercars along winding roads with police and traffic to contend with. We then move on to Test Drive 2 and it adds an opponent to beat. And suddenly this feels an awful lot like the Need for Speed's head-to-head mode. But another subtle carryover from the sort of Test Drive style was this idea of the car showcase. Test Drive just gives you sort of all these stats when you're looking at them, but the Need for Speed took that very much into the multimedia age, and it was trying to show off a brand new 3D console with CD-ROM and multimedia capabilities. So of course you get lots of videos of the cars, and on the 3DO version, the very extreme X-Man as an opponent. He's very 90s and he is thankfully gone from the PC version. In terms of versions of the Need for Speed, there is that 3DO version. There's the PC version, which I have, and then later Saturn and PlayStation versions, which keep some of the added content from the PC version, but also add back some of the graphical tricks from the 3DO, which the PC couldn't quite pull off. There are also some Japanese market-only versions called Overdriving DX, and then available in special Nissan versions. The Japanese market Need for Speeds get very complex, and also some of the dashboard photos suggest they were maybe a little bit hastily put together in some places. There's also a special edition, which I also bought. That was probably quite a lot of money for just 2 extra tracks, but it did come with Thrustmaster T2 wheel support, which was kind of important, me having a Thrustmaster T2 wheel. But I don't really want to focus on those other versions here, not least because on playing the 3DO version, I find that I'm actually completely rubbish at it, and I'm not entirely sure why. Now, the PC version back in the day, I never completed either. Really what I liked about it was something that again I feel is that sort of test drive lineage. This was a game which really wanted to make you feel like you were in a car, doing car stuff. And you may feel by today's standards the handling model is very primitive. There is a very noticeable situation going on where your car always turns at a wider radius when you're braking, and it always turns at a tighter radius when you're accelerating. Meaning that if you want to go winning that tournament, then you're going to have to brake for the corners and then commit hard to them. Something which I occasionally succeed at. Other times I don't succeed at, but realise I can do some sort of Dick Dastardly manoeuvre to keep the opponent car behind me anyway. But in terms of where this game sits, it comes a few years before that great shift to simulation fidelity which Grand Prix Legends popularised. Indeed, games just weren't that realistic, and even Sims had very basic, simulation. So this, for its time, is actually a realistic game, and this comes to that point where it feels more like a test drive than a Need for Speed. Because compared to later games in the series, it does take a very realistic, serious angle on it. It really does want you to feel like you're in a car with all of the limitations and drawbacks that entails, rather than living out some sort of street racing fantasy where you can whip round corners as fast as you please. And this is something that comes as a pleasant surprise to me now. See, when I owned this game originally, I was far too young to be driving cars on the road. Indeed, my sum total of experience of driving a car was taking a Ford Granada very slowly round a car park while someone else operated the pedals for me. But still, I loved cars. I loved any game like this which made you feel like you were in a car and not really being able to judge the realism of it one way or another. No, I didn't really care. I just made up my own rules for what felt realistic, and this felt realistic. It has actual sampled sounds for shifting gears. How more realistic could you get? But the surprise for me now, having driven mini cars, some of them quite fast, some of them round a track, is this really still does feel like fast road driving. I mean, obviously the simulation fidelity is not at the level of something like BeamNG or Assetto Corsa, and the cars in this are certainly not going to do what my car in real life does. But there's still that same thing of planning your route, checking your limit points, seeing, have I got a nice series of sweeping curves that I can just go through as quickly as I please, local laws permitting? Or do I have a tight, nasty blind entrance to a tunnel where I should probably just slow down and take it a bit easy? I find it impressive that a game so old is still able to instill that feeling. It's really nice and playable. It's something you don't always get going back to some of these 90s games. Comparing it to Screamer, which I looked at a little while ago, this really does feel so much more plausible and so much more natural. There's none of that sudden, if you're going faster than this, then the car will skid whether you like it or not. There's a sort of nice gradual transition between in control and out of control. The game does make some compromises to do what it does on 486s, or if you want to play in SVGA mode, kind of low to mid-range Pentiums. The graphics engine is very much optimised to you always facing in the same direction and not viewing anything from too large an angle. Which leads to a thing that even reviewers at the time commented on, which is that when you turn your car round, the camera switches to chase mode, so you can't change the angle of the view and see that most of these buildings probably don't have a back. This also makes it feel like more of a test drive than it does the later Need for Speed games, whose 3D graphics were noticeably more, 3D. If you start applying that sort of Doom clone terminology to it, it's almost a kind of 1.5D game in that really the only position that matters is how far along the road you are, and you have a little bit of left and right, but you can't really go more than a couple of cars' widths off the road in either direction, even on the most generous levels. And this is something that the test drives do. You're very, very constrained. I mean, in the original test drive, extremely constrained, because there's a giant wall one side and there's a drop off a cliff the other. Yet another test drive element is that you have a sort of limited number of lives. Now, on the 3DO, this includes cars. If you have too many crashes, you will lose all your lives and not be able to continue. The PC is a bit more lenient. Your only lives are being caught by the police, mainly because if you keep crashing into other cars, you will have no hope of winning. And another thing that feels a little bit vintage is that there's no real tweaking you can do with the AI. I mean, by this point, IndyCar racing and NASCAR racing had a percentage slider, but Need for Speed does have just one difficulty, and it's actually moderately tough if you're not a driving game aficionado. Well, this leads to a slightly odd thing, where the enemy cars are almost as fast as a player on the straights, but they are quite a bit slower than the player around corners. Meaning that the early tournament, where you're in Class C cars that are slower and mostly on tracks where you can go full speed all the time, are actually quite a bit more difficult than the final tournament, where you're in Class A cars and the AI really does slow down for corners quite a lot compared to how fast you can tear around them. One caveat of that is you do have to tear around the corner on the road, unlike maybe some of the PS2 Need for Speeds that I played, where wall riding seems to be an essential part of your winning strategy. Even straying onto the gravel at the side of the road will slow you down quite a bit in Need for Speed, and hitting anything like an actual wall will almost certainly see you overtaken by an enemy car, even if it's not hard enough a collision to set the car rolling over in one of Need for Speed's admittedly quite impressive crashes. So remember a magazine reviewing this back in the day, saying that one of the most joyful things you could do in it was, quote, smash into the A-Team in their stupid van. Well, PC Magazine, I'll have you know the A-Team's van is not green. I mean, it's quite an essential characteristic of it that Mr. T's van is black with a red stripe up the side. Another thing this early Need for Speed does, which I always felt was a bit lacking from some of the later games, is these feel like plausible roads. Now, having said that, that was going away even by the point you unlock the bonus track, with Las Vegas certainly a bit arcadey. And the added tracks in the special edition are also a little bit fantastical. But ignoring those anomalies, you have a road called City, which feels like driving through the underpasses and bridges of a city. You have a road called Coastal, which feels like a drive along a piece of coastal road. You have a road called Alpine, which maybe it's a little wide for what we in Europe would consider Alpine, but it still has that nice sort of mountainous feel. These feel like actual roads, whereas even Need for Speed 2 started turning them into sort of strange set pieces and having unrealistically large jumps. And again, I may be labouring this point, but that's a test drive thing. Wild set pieces and crazy tracks, yes, is a Need for Speed thing. Whereas driving a realistic-ish, and set your expectations for 1994 here, car along a realistic-ish road, that's very much more test drive to me. And I know it would be easy to be cynical about my motives, and after all, I'm making this for YouTube. But that's not actually the case. This was something that I immediately felt upon playing this for the first time in sort of probably 5-10 years. I mean, I do return it to it every so often. It's a game I enjoyed. And certainly the first time I ever built the tournament. But I get away from myself. One of the things which I felt soon as I was driving down one of those roads, especially in that head-to-head mode with the traffic and the police and the other things, was this really does feel like the Great Lost Test Drive. Now, there is more to look at here. For example, I have a copy of the supposedly extremely rare We All Need Extra Speed CD, which, I mean, it is just some track editors downloaded from the internet and some tracks. It's things that probably are not rare in and of themselves, other than the packaging, and as you may be able to see a Need for Speed 2 CD somewhere behind there, I've played quite a lot of games in this series, and I probably could go take a look at them. Most of them, which I don't think are that similar to Test Drive. But while I am no stranger to making a 50-minute video covering everything I can possibly think of to say about a game, maybe today isn't the time to do it. Maybe it's the time to just say, I enjoyed having a play of the Need for Speed, and finally winning that tournament, and also proving to myself that I'm not totally rubbish at it. I'm just rubbish at the video version.